to the Ace Tech Resources podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina, and today we have a very special guest by the name of Mr. Harvey Rodstein. Harvey has a lot of knowledge in the field of MultValue, so if this is something interesting to you, stick around, get comfortable, give this episode a listen, and I hope you enjoy. All right, we're recording. Everyone, please welcome Mr. Harvey Rodstein. Harvey, is it Rodstein or Rodstein?
My father always said Stein.
Oh, that's nice. Okay, everyone, please welcome Harvey Rodstein. He has graced us with his presence and his knowledge today in MultValue. How you doing today, Harvey?
Doing great, Sabrina. How are
you? Good. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to, help us learn some more today about MultValue. Let's start off with one of my favorite questions. I think this helps people get a much better understanding of MultValue in general. Can you tell me in your own words what MultValue means to you?
Means a number of things. Means my first programming job. And from that point, it meant a way to manage multi-dimensional data. That was something very, very unique at the time. So seeing how they were managing in this virtual machine and repeating sets of data, that was intriguing. So that's where it came from. Back in those days, I was working on a system called Reality. So it wasn't MultValue, it was Reality. Microsoft is what they called their MultValue environment. First job out of school, not really. That's a lie. First job deciding to leave a previous job and actually get back into programming. And it proved a good move. It was a very good move. The MultValue naming later on, everybody was trying to think of a way to unify the industry. The name came up, they're calling it MultValue because of the uniqueness of the MultValue data. But again, let's put quotes around it, MultValue. Many values to this. Well, I guess we'll talk about that more.
That's perfect. Yeah, thanks, Harvey. Do you remember what it was that initially drew you to MultValue?
Yeah. I was making $5,000 a year and I got offered 14. Very bluntly. I have been looking for a job programming because I had an undergraduate degree in engineering and had been working on some postgraduate on that. So I said, okay, this thing is not working out. I'm going to go back to programming. And I answered the ad in the newspaper and drove out to meet the principals in New Jersey. And some people out there in the community remember the name of Cy Fertig at MSLDCT. They were distributors for Microsoft, like the Microsoft Microdata. Oh, I've been indoctrinated. And I worked on the DCT side, which was the programming side. And I learned by doing. And on an old Reality box, I think it was a 1600, 16 users, 2 10 meg disk drives, which each one was the size of a washing machine.
Oh my gosh.
That's what drew me there. And for many years, this was 1977. And all through the late 70s and into the 80s, it only grew. Even started getting to new branches in the 90s. Kind of dropped out for a while there. I dropped out of it, but I stayed connected to it, and it was a good choice.
Now, Harvey, you said you were with it, in the 70s, and this is something that John mentioned as well. And my dad, he'll tell you he is stuck in the 70s. He loves it. Yeah. Do you remember? Was there anything, really cool that stuck out to you as far as being in MultValue during the 70s? What was that like?
Well, it didn't matter what you were in the 70s. If you were in computers, people looked like you were a nerd or you worked for the government or something, or bank. It meant a lot to me because I had, my background is the first computer I ever looked at and got to touch was in 1963 when I was 10 years old. And my dad took me to where he was working, and they had an IBM 1401. And it was an entire room in a block building on an Air Force base. It had 4K of core memory and 8K drum for doing virtual trades. And all you could do with talk to it was a printer. It printed out. It did paper tape, I think, with their tape drives. I know everything, but I had key punches in the corner, so you could punch cards and
Mm.
then key cards to the machine. So that was my first introduction. And in college, I did a lot of work, but it's teletype machines on an IBM where you coded on a piece of paper and you then punched your card, you submitted it to the data center, and they would run it. 4 or 5 hours later, you'd get your compile error back. Interesting, slow. So when I first applied for this job, I had only had experience with some PDP machines. I was writing some Fortran, but nothing for business. And I saw this machine that was in a rack the size of a refrigerator that was supporting 816 users, which was really unheard of at the time. And
Mhm.
that's what kept me going with it because it was beyond just the multi-value. At that point, the operating system itself, the reality operating system, is one of the early instances of a virtual machine because the way they implemented the data was very similar to the way data was mapped into memory. And that's how they had it working, was that,
Mm.
let's say, a file, and people who've worked with multi-value see the file is made up in frames, and then you have to size the file with either it's going to be dynamic or you're going to decide what the module of the file is. And that's just determines that when a record is going to be put in the file, what portion of it is going to be put into what sublist, basically. That's the
Mm.
way you manage memory.
Mhm.
Now, every file was just a set of blocks of memory. But the point is, they're just every item, which is a record, is nothing more than a string, a memory matrix, basically, a string of data. There was really no separate data model versus the memory model. When you're looking at a file and you're looking at the contents of the file, you were looking at strings in virtual memory. The entire disk was virtual memory. Even if you had 10 megabytes out there, you only had like, what was it? Geez, how many K was it? Maybe 64K of memory. Oh, and it would be trading out and supporting all these users. This was quite an advantage at the time. It was an advantage that drew a lot at a price point too. You could get into a nice computer for under $100,000. And for many businesses, that was very intriguing, especially businesses who wanted to do things, automate what they were doing, but really didn't have the resources for a staff of programmers. But because the system had been designed not only with the data model and not only as a virtual system to handle so many users, it had a very advanced query language that was bundled
Mm.
part and parcel of it. Back then they called it English. So that a businessman who was smart could write their own code,
Mm.
which sounds kind of like, well, people do that all the time now. Well, it's a big change. How many people came out of learning computers in college or even understanding computers by the time they were 20 back in 1977 versus now, where every kids grow up with a computer in their hand?
Yeah.
Had a lot of experience with some of the younger programmers, well, I call younger, 30 to 40, kind of scary, isn't it? Who come out of school, and by the time they're 30, they have their PhDs, and they've been working with some of the component stuff and the microservices and everything that's out there. There's really no training lag. You know what I mean? They
Mhm.
come out understanding this. They come out of school understanding this. This is what they're trained in. So it's a different world right now than it was back then. Much different.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Well, thank you, Harvey. That's perfect. That actually answered my next question. I was about to ask, what made you stay with it, but from what it sounds like, you loved the reliability and its memory. Yeah.
Well, reliability, we'll talk about that.
Uh-oh.
See, yeah, talk about, I know one of the questions coming up, and it has to do with what would
Mm-hmm.
make you change about it.
Perfect. Yeah, let's get on to that one. So, do you have any, big gripes with multi-value and what your recommendations are to change it?
I have, especially in my generation, I have always will have a gripe of overnight file saves and then checking the tapes. Let's say it took 6, 7 tapes or more,
Mhm.
back your system up. Sometimes that took very long, but even so, um, it was a nightmare when we had to use tape because let's say the third tape had a parity error because invariably The person who had the computer didn't refresh tapes. To buy tapes, they're expensive. And
Mm.
so rather than always keeping like new tapes, for example, you back your system up, you always back it on a fresh tape or maybe been written on less than 2 or 3 times. But taking tapes that had been used, 7, 8 times or more, and because they were running overhead, because they were magnetics, iron particles on acetate or some kind of plastic, it would wear off going across the heads of the machine. And so you get areas of the tape where you get parity errors because data could not be recorded there anymore because there was no more magnetic material in the tape.
Oh
Be
my
that as it may. Even now with the backups that are going on, I see from machine, large, very large systems with lots of users and lots of data still can take over 24 hours to back up. Different approaches I've been seeing people taking using the MultValue database, but that's just something that has been endemic since the beginning.
Wow.
And
Yeah, that's a.
I'm sure you'll hear people comment on that one. So I threw that one out there. It's fresh meat, guys. Go for it.
Yeah, that's rough. That there's got to be a better way, a more efficient process.
90% of the things that were bothering me about the system, I wrote around with Nucleus. That was many years in the making, and actually grew out of being between actually working as a programmer and teaching for a while. That's a gripe. It's also a gripe that if you have very, very, very large files, some cases you really have to write the code that backs them up and keeps them manageable size. And even when it's a huge amount of data, and I've seen files that have 500 meg, 600, 700 meg or more, within the engine, to get through some of that takes a while. To update a dynamic file, for example, or you want to move one data from one file to another, and you're not sure how to size it, use dynamic. The overhead there is slow. Sometimes you only get 2 or 3 writes in a second, or maybe less than that. So, if you're going through a million records, that takes a long time. You need more power. Other
Yeah.
points are that on a very large amount of data, even with trees and certain indexing, it still takes a long time to churn through it if you're doing some mass amounts of data.
Oh.
So much so that in some cases I've gotten to basically whenever you're writing the certain amounts of data you need available for search. So at write time, you can throw triggers in that anytime I write to the file, I'm also going to write to a queue. That queue picks up the record and mirrors it for retrieval in a database that can walk through like half a gigabyte of data in less than 10 seconds. Just for certain retrievals that you need, because it kind of gets annoying when you're sitting there and do a select and it takes, and then maybe if it's select is quick, then just to get through that data is taking you many process cycles. Gotten around it sometimes by actually creating parallel processes where you have to get through a lot of data. So you chunk up the select into sub blocks and you feed it to parallel processes that are all churning through their own sublist. That's worked. I've turned things that take over a minute into things that take less than 10 seconds. So, it's nice that the model gives you that, but many models give you that. That's kind of like some of my pet peeves with it.
No, that's all right. No, that's amazing, and that's partially why I was so excited, Harvey, to have you on. I remember you mentioning the nucleus. That's so interesting. I hadn't heard of it. Okay, just a couple more, and I'll let you go. I know you're very busy. Let's move on to the fifth one. What are some of your fondest memories in the field?
I like programming, but I'm not fond of it, as a memory. But it's the relationships, the people I met, people early on, the few people I worked with ended up being roommates in some cases. Still contact with them to this day. Really good friendships, good connections. That's what it's like any time. It was the prime of life, and all the friends and people we worked with and got to know, and all the good times.
That is such a wonderful. Wow.
So there's some things I choose not to remember.
Uh-oh. You know what? That's not on the list, so don't worry about that one. Appreciate the honesty. Let's move on. What do you think the future of multi-value looks like? What can we expect?
That's a good question because I know what I'm expecting because I know the people I'm dealing with and some of the projects that I know Binary Star's working on. Specifically, we're moving out of the character-based model in many ways. We still use it for development, and but what we're doing is we're trying to create engines that use the data that's there, that's been cultivated for many, many years,
Mhm.
and make it available to new technology. For example, designing a screen or designing an application. We're going a lot of the routes separating tasks, meaning we're going to define the application based on talking to who's using the current one. Let's say we're trying to modernize a PIC model and design a user interface and a user experience which is more in line with modern practices, where it streamlines and creates a visual environment that becomes almost intuitive for that particular task that you're doing. Specifically, one of the ones I've been working on and consulting on is a dispatching system that has to integrate with all the data from a multi-value database. So I see, at least in our direction, is that we're going to be using the multi-value model as business rule repository. Nucleus becomes the business rules, and every transaction to an external source web, be it, is done through an API. So you design the application based on the needs of the design, you create the API, it produces the data and goes to whatever new modern front ends you want to use. So that's one of the directions I see us going for the future. This also includes being able to put together intuitive interfaces and converting existing code using advanced AI technique. We've got some
Ooh.
programmers deeply working in basically turning designs into user interfaces and being able to generalize those, which would be very easy then to service off a UV database with the embedded requests for the, basically embed the API in that generation. Also got some people internally. So we're moving toward that, moving toward codeless application design, but all using multi-value as the data repository.
Wow, that is so cool. So you're integrating AI with multi-value.
Well, it's like integrating anything with multi-value. If, for example, you've all the, especially in legacy, you've got all this code, all this time invested in managing your data. Okay, and it's hard to get out of it. A lot of large corporations have taken over smaller companies that were using multi-value, failed at duplicating what they did in multi-value, didn't understand it and threw it out, and
Mm.
basically ended up with something that was a loss and does only a portion of what the old app did. And
Mm.
the idea to be able to bring all that into the 21st century, our step is to generalize that. We're creating a rule set that not only will work on the character-based terminal, but will work servicing data to external requests like external APIs. If you can do a REST, you want to do sockets, you want to do any kind of interface system, the system becomes a server for this API. That's been kind of exciting because still working with the same data model, still thinking the same way of storing the data, of managing the data, but I no longer have to write a user interface. All I'm doing is worrying about what data has to be stored, creating the rule set that makes a function of how you insert or delete data from that virtual business rule. All the rules for update, all the rules for retrieval are in one place. I can then point to that object and use it. Any other application that ends up being written for any interface. So I don't have to write an application that's specific to be a web application or write an application that's specific to be any other kind of service. I can concentrate on the data and provide a general API for that service to aid the service or just produce data. And then any kind of other user interface can be enhanced or developed because user interfaces are going to go all forth in the future. Okay. For example, in this system that we're looking at, the dispatching, to do it through a character-based screen, you have to know what screen to go to, menu option 4, submenu 5, get there. Now go to this field, fill this in, hit return, go to this field, fill this in. Now press this button, go fill that in. and file that whole thing. And that should take care of what you need to do, what you want to do. And that's pretty typical of screen-based screens. And let's say that all you were doing there was assigning a driver to a job, let's say. And but what if I just wanted to say, on a point to the driver, I know what job I'm dealing with. Oh yeah, let's just drag him onto the job. Okay. So what happens is you've turned 4 or 5 steps into a gesture. So that's where I see most things going, and soon interfaces are going beyond that. Okay. Characters are going to be characters. Input screens are going to be input screens. That's not the case. But more advanced applications that are like dispatch or like monitoring certain manufacturing systems and interfacing that to your data. That's a little bit different. And those kind of interfaces also need to be talked to. And well, my final argument, I guess it is, on really paying attention to the user experience and user interface is that training time for new people who have to use that is greatly reduced. Something I've seen, something that would take 8 weeks to a few months to learn because it's that complex. There's so many things you have to remember. Abstracted into a really well-designed user interface for the experience, the training time goes down to less than maybe 4 weeks. Like 3 or 4 concepts you really got to put together or actually implied in how the user is using the interface. Maybe it's more like gaming, I don't know. But that's where I see it going. That's where I hope it goes. It's going to save it in a lot of larger companies that are desperately, the board wants them to get off. They're desperately looking for something new. And a lot have kind of tripped over themselves to do that and realize that this is going to take a while, or it's, and there's all the divisions that are on the multi-value data, and begrudgingly so, because they can't get off it. When you're dealing on code, and here's the hardest part. When you're dealing with code that's 30, 40 years old and was written on the fly, a little bit of the code takes care of talking to the data. Then in that same program, the next code takes care of writing something to the screen. Then the next code takes care of looking for something else, and then writing a little bit more data, and then waiting for input from the screen. And it's all in line. That's all legacy. That's most legacy multi-value. That is what is the challenge to get a handle on.
Wow.
Maybe I talked too much.
No, that's really, it's nice. I appreciate, you're just keeping it real. I've heard that, yeah, it can be clunky for sure. But it's nice to hear a positive outlook. For sure, there's changes, that need to be implemented, but it's just it's fun hearing people with as much experience as you have. It's always fun hearing, what they think the trajectory of it looks like. So yours is it's nice. Thank you. I love positivity.
Well, it's good. It's good to hear I'm positive.
You're authentic, but there's some positivity sprinkled in there. I'd say that there's a lot of hope. What advice would you give someone just coming into the field of multi-value?
Depends on where you're coming into. Programming is new to you, that's one thing. If you've already been in programming and you're just coming into multi-value, you'll find a lot of, it's a lot of fun. I've always had fun with it. It's nice to be able to use the data model for complex relationships. The data model was developed for keeping, I think it was manufacturing inventory for Cheyenne. I'm not sure which helicopter it was, many years ago. And that was required to have a bill of materials explosion, which means one part might be made of subparts. Subparts might be made of subparts. Being able to design simply data that represents that without abstracting the so many tables that a SQL database would almost fall over because of the recursive nature of it, especially back in those days, gives a lot of gives you a lot of insight as to why the people used it and why it's still pretty much used today. Again, I'm kind of out of it. I don't. I haven't attended a lot of industry work, kind of on sidelines these days, more kind of like consulting and answering questions than anything else. And so I'm kind of insular. All my answers are based on a hermit in many ways. That's the way I hope things will go. We'll see.
We will see, huh? It's exciting to see where it goes.
Well, yeah.
Well, Harvey, that's all I got for you.
Well, be kind in your editing. I was a little bit
Oh,
rambling there.
no, you did amazing. I can't thank you enough, Harvey. This was awesome. Every time I do a podcast episode, I just learn so much more nuggets of knowledge, and it's so cool. It's really a beautiful thing to see how much people love MultValue.
For the pleasure. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Sabrina.
Thank you, Harvey. Well,
It's just-
Harvey, I
It's a
don't
pleasure.
want to
Thank
keep you.
Sabrina. That's okay. It's good to talk to you, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Harvey. Yes, and thank you for your information, your knowledge, and yeah, it was my pleasure. Something else, whatever you want to talk about, you have a lot to say. I'm very interested.
Okay, very nice. We'll do that.
Alrighty.
Thanks, Sabrina.
Thanks, Harvey. Take care now. Bye bye. And this concludes our podcast episode with Mr. Harvey Rodstein. Thank you all again for stopping in. I'm Sabrina. Contact us anytime with any questions, comments. Thank you so much. Take care. Have a great day. Bye bye now.